I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Today we speak about conscious parenting while facing collapse with conscious parenting advocate, facilitator, and counselor Becca Young Allen. All right. I am particularly looking forward to this conversation today with Becca Young Allen, person that I've had the pleasure of interviewing and have really good conversations with over the past couple of years in various online summits that Carolyn Baker and I were producing for a while there. And it's with special excitement and pride that I get to have you in this conversation, Becca, that you're really stepping up in a wonderful way to kind of co-participate in the formulation of what I think we both find very exciting as a conversation, which is parenting in these times. Parenting in these times of collapse of Earth and human systems. So Becca, I'm just really excited to have you here on this podcast. And this is actually the first of many, many interviews. This is part of the first wave of these interviews for this parenting series, Parenting in Times of Collapse of Earth and Human Systems. And we're just now formulating a far more poetic and artful way to name this series, and that I think is also coming along really well. And I just again wanted to give the most basic level introduction of you, Becca, and why I'm excited to have you in this conversation and on this team of folks who are interested in producing this series of interviews at large. Because you obviously have something to say at a time when people with something of some kind of heft are hard to find. Some people with something to say in these times are hard to find. There's lots of blather about the state of the world and all the various things that are competing for our attention 24/7, and the things that our cultures globally are doing to take us down. You know, literally, I'm hard pressed to find good news these days. And so to find someone like yourself who has been about as aware as anyone else I know about what's going on in the world and what are some of the most difficult and demanding challenges and predicaments that we're facing. And you have the hands-on experience, the life lived experience of taking your family out of the thick of it in the business as usual culture into a far more conscious arrangement. And so it's with that I'm just thrilled to have you contributed in whatever way you want to. It's been a joy to have you up till now. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the notes that you started your participation with here. And what a wonderful place to start with. I think anyone watching this interview is going to really get a sense of your experience in this realm and how multidimensional your experience is in a time when we just so desperately need that, that perspective. Becca, thanks so much for joining me and us here. And would you do me the favor of filling in any other piece that really would have you be introduced exactly the way you'd like to be introduced?
Thanks, Dean. It's a pleasure to be here, and I feel really grateful to be a part of the conversation with the many people that will be in this series of conversations. I guess my story, I'll just tell a little bit of background about me so that people can understand. My husband at the time and I, in 2002, became aware of the, let's say, the madness of the system that we were living in, and made a choice to change direction for our family pretty radically. We were living in living a corporate life in Southern Connecticut, and living in a large home, and all the American dream things that we're taught to want. And but it was a very I call it now my time in the desert, because looking back on it from the place of richness that we're living in now, the amount of connection and relationship that was available in that life was just very, very different. So we left that behind. We sold the big house and we moved to the country, and took our kids out of school and tossed the television. Those were the big moves that we made. I think that were probably some of the most impactful ones. And I have to say that it was a move that was made with fear pushing us, right? Because we were looking at all of these systems, and it when we looked at the fragility of the systems of our country, and we realized just what a pyramid scheme everything was, at least the economy. And then just-in-time delivery on everything else. Once you realize that it's a very delicate balance of how everything actually functions, and that it wouldn't really take that much to bump that out of whack, let alone all of the things that we currently are facing right now. So there was definitely fear that was pushing us from behind, while at the same time there was also this pull, because I knew that we were heading towards something that felt like a better life for our family. So while fear was pushing us, there was also this pull towards just creating the life that we want to live, rather than fitting into the life that we've been told is the one that we want. And so we made a really big move, and there were many, many cycles, I'll say. We went through and gone through many, many cycles of fear in relationship to this, as we look at the different data sets, and continue to come to terms with, well, what might collapse look like, and how might that impact us, and how might we need to take some steps now to create redundant systems, so that we just have a little bit more support, both just physically and in a community sense, when things begin, when the trouble comes to our own doors, right? We know that the troubles are present for millions on the planet right now, and we are fortunate enough to have it not impacting us in the United States right now. So we made a big move, and have just been learning all along the way. when I was talking to my children about doing this series, and I said, we're gonna talk about collapse aware parenting, and I'd love to understand, know what you guys think about this. My children are now 19, 21, and 25. So they're in their adulting phase. And it was funny because they didn't really have a sense that of the why that we were moving. Why were we making all of these changes? We didn't talk to them about it. I mean, back then they were, 8, 5, and 3, so much, much younger. But we didn't talk to them about it. We weren't holding it in a fearful way with them. We were in relationship to our own fear with ourselves and with each other, the conversations that we would have. But we didn't share that with the kids at the time. And so that even though it was the fear that pushed the move and the change, it wasn't a regular part of daily life for us, which I feel really grateful for. So they didn't really have a sense that this was a collapse aware move. They just knew we were going to be moving, and that we were really looking to find community, that's what we were seeking, that was the most important thing when we really looked at the whole spectrum, that finding community was, and creating community was probably one of the most important things that we needed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that they understood even then.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate you giving us that kind of that background. It sounds to me, when I hear that part of your story, that you already had some pretty considerable self-regulation skills between yourself and your spouse at the time, that you had enough capacity in yourselves to be able to manage that and hold that between the two of you.
Mm-hmm.
That meaning, if we can use the kind of clinical language of when we get dysregulated, when we get knocked off track, when we get somehow knocked out of what could be called a resilience zone, a place where we have our wits about us, and we have some humor, and we have some capacity for tension in the space or anxiety or whatever. Ideally, we each have some amount of being regulated, of being able to stay in that zone. And it sounds like, even though you were very aware of the pieces of the business as usual world that you wanted to get out of, and it wasn't a comfortable space for you, you still had enough of that resilience zone in reach,
Mm-hmm.
that you were able to buffer
Yeah.
the experience of your then pretty young children. Can you say anything about that, and how that kind of skill, that kind of inner toolkit for keeping your wits about you and yourself as present as possible, how has that grown or expanded over time?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Well, I would say that I'm fortunate because my baseline personality is not one that's tremendously anxious. I think that people that have a baseline of anxiety that's present just in regular everyday life, then when you add on the potential collapse of the planet and social systems and all of that, it puts you into the red pretty fast. So I feel grateful that my starting point was not from a place of daily anxiety. Honestly, I would say in the early years, Dean, one of the things that really helps with the regulation, it sounds so silly, but there were just these little steps that we would take, that little physical concrete steps that would help our emotional regulation. So for instance, if I was having a fear around, well, what if there's no trucking and there's no food in the stores? I mean, that we lived for 10 years in North Carolina in an area that had hurricanes come through, and we saw that happen all the time. Even 2 inches of snow on the ground would empty the stores of food in North Carolina. So, that wasn't some far out improbable thing. I knew that just a single ice storm could do that. So just taking simple steps like having extra food in the house, having stored food that would last for many, many years, just taking that tangible step towards a little bit of resilience really helped. So what I found is that what we would do, and we did do this together, which I'm really grateful for, is that we would, a level of fear would expand. We would read some new thing that would bring up the panic, and we would kind of assess, okay, well, what steps can we take? Is there something that we can do now that we should do? And then we would figure out what the doing was, if there was a doing to do. And once that was completed, there was just a state of, okay, there we go. Because so much of the, I think, fear that we're all holding around our future right now is that it is in the realm of the unknown. We don't know. We don't know how this is going to go. We don't know how it's going to unfold. We don't know what's going to go wrong first. We don't know which systems are going to collapse first. We just don't know. So just taking it's almost sort of just taking a tiny step towards, okay, well, at least I know I can do this one thing. At least I know that I have extra food and water in the basement if we run low. Just that one step really helped a lot. And so I found that what we did was we kind of used the fear waves that would come through to create the motivation needed to take whatever steps were the next steps in the process of creating more resilience in our life. So that's kind of a funny thing, because it's this external action that helped with the internal regulation. That's just one example. But beyond that, there's the meta. Because I'm trained as a therapist, and I have a background in emotional healing work, I'm very aware that when we're in fearful thinking, we tend to see things as black and white. And all of the shades of gray just disappear. And it's just going to be this or that. And so just the knowing of that, for me, just the knowing, it was one of the things that would help me track my own state was, do I notice that I'm getting into black and white thinking about calamity? And if I did notice that I was in black and white thinking, that was my cue to just pull back, take care of myself, do whatever the self-care was needed, go to my therapist, but so much of it is learning to just be present with our emotions and allow them to exist in our bodies. Because so much of our whole culture is designed to avoid anything uncomfortable. Just keep us entertained, keep us distracted so that we don't feel what's going on. And so, I think so much of parenting in these very difficult times is really getting to know ourselves well, getting to know our emotional state, and learning to be present with discomfort in our own bodies without trying to shut it down through sort of the usual strategies of, whatever we use, whether it's, the drink at the end of the day, or, going shopping, or, whatever the various kind of addictive responses to that we all have, so many different options. when we're responding to difficulty. So I feel like the collapse context is well, regular old life without potential collapse offers up enough challenge, enough difficulty, enough hardship, that it's like the practicing that we need to do to learn how to weather and ride the waves of what our regular life difficulties offer. When we continue to practice that kind of work for ourselves, that just helps with the larger issue, which is essentially just, a much bigger expression of the many waves, when we have an unexpected death in the family, divorce, any medical issues, any not being able to pay the mortgage. I don't have enough money to put oil in my tank this winter. Whatever the regular life problems that everybody in this country are facing every single day, those issues are magnified by the larger collapse context. So, everything that we learn to do to just kind of get through our everyday life, I think really, really helps in the larger context.
Yeah, I'm so curious. There's my experience is that we are already a couple of layers into conversations that most people just don't have in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
But especially now that it seems like it's no longer an option. This is not a discretionary or optional conversation anymore. It was really still very discretionary, I think, when you all decided to choose this more conscious route for where to live, how to parent, and so on. So I'd like to just loop back a little bit, and I have a huge curiosity about how do you communicate with the young people in your life about these large global, some of them global scale challenges, predicaments, problems, and so on. How do you speak about them? And especially when they tend to really slash at the fabric of this society that's supposed to be, at least when I grew up, and I think how most of us have grown up, is we grow up in the assumption that this culture is humming along just fine, and every generation will do better than the last.
Right.
And we're in this ever-growing extravaganza of the growth, infinite growth on a finite planet world. How do you speak with your own children about these assumptions, these mythologies crumbling, really being strained to the point of, starting to, the wheels are starting to come off, and yet still be able to self-regulate, still be able to bring some kind of new possibility and new horizon that a child absolutely deserves. And I know you're immensely committed to. It comes through every time we talk about this project about parenting. Have I said enough to be a cogent question yet?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I think it so depends on the age of your children. Because the youngest children, it's their frame of reference is the family. Their frame of reference is the neighborhood. It's a smaller circle. So with younger children, I think storytelling is one of the most important ways to get at um, how do we handle the hard tunnels that come in our lives. And for the children, it's hero's journey stories, and really focusing on the um, yeah, what happens when that hero has to leave home, or what the heroine has to leave everything that's comfortable behind and step out into this world where they don't know what to do, and everything seems dark and scary, and they don't know who their friends are, they don't know who their allies are. How does that protagonist get through those things, and then come back to home at the end again, come back to that center. um, so the mythologies themselves offer so much, and the teaching. Oh, sorry, I don't know if you can hear that, Dean.
Oh yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Let me see if I can mute that. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, no. Okay. So apologies for that. Um, so, as I said before, what's happening with collapse is that it's bringing our death up close, right? We're going through our lives, and we wake up every day. We're not assuming we're going to be dead by the end of the day. We wake up every day thinking, of course, we're going to be alive by the end of the day. And what collapse does is it brings that death closer, uncomfortably closer to us. But there's so many gifts that come from bringing that death close, because it allows us to bring the preciousness of being alive much more into our being. So with the young children, I tended to focus a lot on the full cycle of life and death, and life and death, and life and death. That things are dying all the time, and that death is what feeds the life to come. So when the forest fire sweeps through, and maybe they heard on the news that California is burning, or you live in California, it's burning. That death, while terrifying and violent, and burns everything in sight, that makes space for the new shoots that come. So just it sounds very meta, it sounds very high level, but that perspective of just having death be a part of our framework in a more day-to-day way, I think is really important, because that understanding of the dying cycle, which is, we're going into a large scale dying cycle. We're in the midst of it right now. That's happening, all the time, in smaller cycles and in ways that we can wrap our minds around. Like here we are in the fall right now as we're recording this. It's autumn and the leaves are turning, and it's going to be winter soon. And that's a mini death that comes every year. So, stopping and looking at roadkill on the side of the road, like looking at death, looking at it, not shying away from it, being with it. I think for the young ones, it's not quite so terrifying in the same way, because it's a little bit more normalized. I think that our culture, because we're so youth oriented and so we're such a baby culture in so many ways, that we house our elders in housing units instead of keeping them close at hand. We push death away all the time, And so, I mean, I think that it's a symptom of our, you know, larger cultural psychosis that's playing out. But um, yeah, so I know it sounds kind of funny, but there's something about just bringing that death in early and letting it be a part of things, letting it be a part of the framework that the children are viewing their life and talking about what, you know, how that animal that ended up on your plate, if you're a meat eater, you know, how did that happen? You know, so it's like facing it, facing the death, but not in the terms of the larger global context, but in terms of the real life death that we are in relationship to all the time. So that's how I did it with the little when they were young.
Yeah.
You know, directly addressing the larger context. It was just, you know, getting comfortable with death.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. And I did attend one of the workshops that y'all produced a few years ago. And I remember the stories that really seemed to captivate all of us who were in the audience were the ones that where you were talking about how those lessons got conveyed in this kind of more rural and certainly more conscious environment that you were living in, you know, down to uh, butchering and taking care of the chickens that you were then going to eat, and the children being a part of that.
Yeah, they've been a
So
part of that for a long time.
yeah, you know, and I just want to let folks know that this is the first of what I'm hoping will be at least a couple, maybe three or more kind of uh, these interviews that will punctuate this longer series, this larger series of interviews with guest speakers. And that what I'm hoping that you and I get to talk about is just a review of the jargon that I use out of having written my book a couple of years ago, The Impossible Conversation, in which I asked what happened to get us here, that we had disconnected from the primary sources of meaning in life, and those being deeper self, our relationship with other people, and then with Earth herself. And that it seems like today we're speaking a bit more on that first person scale, that deeper self. And yeah, we are talking about the issue, you know, this in a frame of parenting, which is obviously with other people. But I know we're going to spend some more time on ways of coming together with other people that are far more specific and far more in depth in later conversation. And I think similarly, there's a lot we could dive into about connecting with Earth. There was one other piece that I'd love to finish up with today with you about that kind of first person orientation, or like how is my attention um, corralled into a certain way of seeing the world, a certain way of orienting my attention and my intent and my participation in the world. And you had one of your notes, you sent out a number of notes that came to you when you were approaching this team of folks that are putting this together. And one of them was being with the hard things.
Mm-hmm.
And the word that comes to mind for me in this is privilege. You know, certainly I've grown up male and white and in an extraordinarily privileged level of our culture and of global culture. And part of that was having to learn really the hard way that there are hard things in life, and that privilege would only take me so far. And then it did a great disservice to my ability to be present through what has to happen in life. Some amount of challenge, some amount of discomfort needs to be built in, and it must be, and is built in. And now we're facing what perhaps is the largest scale existential event in human history. So it doesn't get much more uncomfortable than that. Can you say anything about what you meant by including being with the hard things as one of those? It sounded like you were making it like a cornerstone of how to be more ready each day by taking on the hard things, by having a different way of seeing them and even appreciating them at some point. I don't want to put words in your mouth. Would you say more about it?
Yes, I'd love to. Well, yeah, I mean, as I said before, life will offer us many challenging experiences. There's no way around that. That is a part of life. And because our dominant narrative is one of, I'll say, avoidance of hard things. If you have a headache, you take the pill. If you feel uncomfortable, you distract yourself with this. There's just so many ways that we just try to get out of the hard things. How can I avoid or get away from it? So, as I mentioned before, on the body level, on an emotional level, it's learning to allow the experience of the hard feelings to be in your body, and to just be able to be present with them. So that's internally, a skill that we can cultivate. But on a higher level scale, I would say that one of the key aspects for me around being present with the hard things, like for instance, I was recently divorced. That's a hard thing. Has a lot of difficult feelings, has a lot of, trouble along the way, potentially. And there's a way that in looking at that process where I knew that there was much to harvest from the hard times. So, and if we think about it with our children from a parenting perspective, so let's say somebody's getting bullied on the bus. That's a hard thing, right? We feel, the child feels afraid, hurt, sad, scared, all of the feelings, whatever they are. So number one, being with the hard feelings, hard stuff is being with those feelings and supporting our child to be able to name them. How does it, where do you feel that in your body? What does it feel like in there? So number one is just being able to be with it in your own body. But then it's the learning. So what, what do you think the perspective of that other person is, of the bully? What's their perspective? Why do you think they're bullying? What is going on for that other person? So being able to take a different perspective. And then what do we get to harvest? What is the learning? And maybe there's compassion. Maybe the learning is compassion for others that aren't regulated in a way, that do lash out and do painful things, after we set up the appropriate boundaries and say no in all the ways that we need to say no, right? But what is the wisdom? So what is the wisdom that we can begin to gather from those hard times? And if we practice doing that enough, then we know, even if we're going, like I knew going into the divorce, okay, this is a big wave, hard time, right? This is a big one. The bigger the challenge, the greater, I believe, the greater the wisdom that we can harvest from it, the greater the difficulty. So if that's something that is introduced early on to our children, that anytime something really painful and difficult is happening, after you go through that process of really dealing with your feelings around that and figuring out what steps you need to take, that then there is that harvesting and that wisdom gathering that can happen afterwards. So if we have a string of those experiences of going through hard times and not just surviving it and getting through it, but actually getting through it from a deeper understanding of ourselves and others, then that's a good thing to know. And then that gives us a little bit more confidence and a little more awareness when we can go and when the next wave comes. And I like to think about these as waves too, that the hard times come in waves, that it's not a consistent, perpetual hard time. It doesn't really work that way. Some people's lives experience a lot of suffering for a long period of time, but even within that context, there are waves that come through. So there's a way of holding the knowing that this is a wave, that this hard time is a wave, which means that it will move through. That I think is also really helpful for holding, for being able to regulate during the difficulty.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. I grew up surfing, and so using the word waves about any emotional experience in our bodies and in our relationships, that's just the way I've talked about them forever. So I appreciate you using similar words. I can feel our time together is just about drawing to a close, and I want to put out a teaser. I'm not a big fan of doing this, but I kind of want to put out a teaser for our next conversation. Yeah. And to me, I am not a parent. I've done a lot of work actually training adults and parents to work with very troubled teens here in the UK for a number of years. And I imagine that one of the most difficult things to express, beyond the examples that you just gave, which I absolutely appreciate, I try to imagine myself in the conversation with children of, especially later teens. They're about ready to break out into this world of supposedly immense possibilities. And I think we're facing times that, at least in the privileged countries of the world, have assigned to be the times of ultimate possibility. Here's, every door is open to you. You can do anything in your life, and so on. And I'm not trying at all to say that that is no longer so. Mm-hmm. But what I would love to, again, just kind of put a teaser out there, maybe you could also just partially respond in shorthand. Some of the challenges that you have either directly experienced or can anticipate as a young person looks into this world as it now stands, politically, economically, environmentally, and so on. How is it different than when you or I grew up? How is that transition, that time of immense possibility and open horizons, how is it different now? Is there anything you could say, again, in that kind of slightly evasive shorthand that we could dive deep into in our next conversation?
Yeah. Well, I believe that it's such a time of shifting narrative. Mm-hmm. And that because the dominant narrative is essentially not truthful anymore. It's not a truthful narrative. That bringing that when you share with your teens and your older children the truth of where we are, that it's so valuable because it has the opportunity to release them from the paradigm that they're living in that will not satisfy or nourish them necessarily. So if we say, yeah, that life, it's just not going to be like that anymore. We know that. It's going to be a different life. We don't really know what it's going to be like, but it's going to have really different opportunities and really different um, places for us to express our gifts in the world. And that if everything is about how do we most, how can we take what's here? How can we take our deepest gifts and offer them to the world in whatever way, regardless of what's happening in a larger context, whether we're in a privileged country or whether we're in a collapsing environment, getting those gifts out. And it's just going to be a different place for their gifts to be expressed. And so I think it's really about like being really truthful about how the current paradigm isn't real. It's just not real. And then if you can break down the current story and the places where it's just not real, then we can say, well, what is real? And what do you want to be real? And from that state of your own passion and your own gifts, what if you take away the whole story of how it's been, and then you ask, well, but within the context of all of these systems changing radically, how do I fit in to that world?
Yeah, well said. Well said. And just evasive enough that, we, that we still have plenty to talk about when it
Oh,
comes
yeah.
time.
Just getting started.
Yeah. So, Becca, I just I promised myself, and I'm hearing a similar. I don't know if it's promise or just commitment from every person that's involved with this project, yourself included, to really have this be something, an expression that comes from our hearts and from the fullness of our being, rather than yet another thing that's created by kind of a linearity and producing the result and so on. Um, I really can't imagine a more important conversation to be having. And it's just really such a privilege to be able to be working with, playing with, conjuring with others
Mm-hmm.
who are on a similar wavelength. And I'm just really wanting to acknowledge that. And it's not just the head heart binary, which is kind of a convenient way to talk about this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm actually noticing is that there are a number of layers um, that are far more articulated and offer far more power in the conversation as we articulate them. That's one of the real joys that I have in speaking with you and others who have so much experience of conscious adult living and conscious adult parenting in in our conversations about this. It's I just can't imagine a more important conversation to be having. So I love that we've covered this amount of the ground, or the new map, if you will, today. I look forward to whenever we might get round two or more done in the future. And just thank you so much for being a part of this spontaneously combusted um, project and collaborative effort between us. And I look forward to seeing how this goes with inviting in so many guest speakers, and then inviting so many collapse aware parents in the world to be the participants in this whole summit or gathering of aligned folks. Thanks so much for all that you're bringing to this.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Dean.
All right.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.